everyone. This is KLMeri.
And this is Soda.
Space Trio is back with another podcast. Today's topic is most talked about Trek species, which, when you think about it, and given that Soda and I started a list, is quite long. There's a number of Trek species we're going to talk about today. So I just say we jump right into it, Soda.
Yeah, we should probably. So, from the very beginning, Star Trek being a sci-fi show about people going to space, we have aliens. Um, the first alien species we encounter is one that is already on the ship.
That's correct. It's probably the most known species for Star Trek, even with non-Star Trek fans.
No, I don't think so. I
Really?
don't think so. Yeah, I think it has a stiff competition from the villains of the show.
But when you think about the main characters of the show, you
Well,
know,
yeah, I mean, well, okay. We are talking about Vulcans, of course,
yes,
but
Vulcans.
I think most people who have never watched Star Trek have heard of Spock, but have no idea what he is, and have heard of Klingons, but can't name a single Klingon.
That's probably very true. However, even if they know of Spock, they can at least physically see some things about him that are characteristics of Vulcans.
That's true. That's true. Um, but Vulcans. Okay, Vulcans are mostly identified by their pointy ears. They look like humans with pointy ears. Um,
And their eyebrows.
and well, yeah, but it isn't universal. I think.
It's
Like,
not universal, but I think in the original design of Vulcans, it was to have the very slanted eyebrows. And we do see that on a number of Vulcans in other shows.
yeah, it's true, but I mean, we also see the bowl cut on a lot of Vulcans, but that wasn't. I don't think that was intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, Vulcans are interesting because they are kind of the only species on the ship besides humans. Like Spock is the only alien on the ship besides, all the humans.
To be honest, to say he is supposed to be like a typical representation of his race is actually a little misleading because he's not fully Vulcan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because this I think will be something that will be kind of repeated throughout Star Trek, which is we first meet someone who's supposedly a representative of their race and culture, but then we kind of find out that they are kind of the opposite of that. That they are actually kind of the outcast.
Interesting thing about Vulcans, they are part of the Federation.
Yeah,
They are one of the founding members of the Federation, along with a few others, which we'll talk about, and including humans.
yeah.
The Vulcans. How do I put this?
Hmm.
The Vulcans are part of. Spock is part of Starfleet. He's a Vulcan. But to say that, at least that's this representation of TOS in TOS, that there's a lot of Vulcans in Starfleet is not true. So Vulcans tend to have their own ships, and it's kind of interesting because they already had an established. I don't want to call it like an armada, but they had an established
Space fleet.
space fleet. Yes,
Yeah.
perfect word. And it had some military purpose, but most of it was space exploring scientific vessels. And lo and behold, here we have Spock, who is a Vulcan and is part of Starfleet, serving on an all-human ship.
Yeah. Um, the original series does a lot to explore Vulcan culture and philosophy, But future series expand on it. I think the series that expand on it the most outside of the original series is probably Enterprise, surprisingly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Enterprise kind of tells the story of how the relationship between humans and Vulcans started before there was even Starfleet. So we get to see, the fleet that the Vulcans had before Starfleet, and we get to see the Vulcan attitude toward humans at first and how they approached, sharing knowledge and all of that. Um, but yeah, Vulcans are defined by their logic.
Yes.
Logic is kind of a loaded term, I think, because logic is kind of subjective, you can say. But I think I've read the take, and I kind of agree with it. Maybe logic is like what we humans translate the Vulcan concept of it to, because what it is actually like not exactly logic, but just the things that are. They take the world as it is and draw conclusion based on it. They are not very imaginative, let's say.
Right. Basically, it almost seems like employ the scientific method.
Yeah,
You take
exactly.
your observations, your facts. You have a hypothesis. You try to correlate all your evidence and to make a very logical supposition of what you should do or what might happen.
Yeah,
Sometimes calculated very precisely.
exactly. And I think it's interesting because I think in modern day, when people talk about, preferring logic over emotions, and it's a big thing in the original series, the battle between logic and emotion, thoughts versus feelings. Today, people kind of tend to think about like logic as being very cold,
Yeah.
but Vulcan logic isn't actually that cold. For example, Vulcans are, for example, vegetarian. They don't eat meat because they think it's illogical to cause suffering, and um, they also, they believe in the principle of the good of the many.
Mm-hmm. I think you have to know, and this, obviously comes up later on, I think, in some of the as they expound on Vulcans and why they are so logical, but you really kind of have to know their history as a race. So,
Yeah,
logic essentially is what helps them maintain mental control over their emotions.
yeah,
Um, because their ancestors were very, I'd say, explosive emotionally and very like passionate, and it led to a lot of fighting and wars that eventually this one Vulcan named Serac said we need a better way and stop fighting amongst ourselves and letting our passions take a hold of us. And that is when they changed their philosophy, so to speak, or many of them adopted that new philosophy of essentially having control over yourself emotionally, mentally, through logic.
yeah. I think it was also hinted at several times that before logic, they were actually so violent that
Yeah.
they kind of they had something similar to the human World War. Like they
Yes.
kind of irradiated their own planet and were on the brink of extinction and all of that.
Mm-hmm. So it might be a misconception that they're so cold and logical that they don't have emotions. They do. They're just very tightly controlled.
Yeah,
We do learn later there is a pure logical state of mind, a purging of all emotion, if you will, that Vulcans can undertake, but it's not really shown to be something that all Vulcans have to do, right?
yeah,
As long as they are able to practice their philosophy and exert that mental control, then that's just what we tend to see in most of the Vulcans in the show.
yeah, that's true. The Vulcans are also, they claim to be very, logical and distant from emotions, but a lot of them are very proud, shall we say. And yeah, and there we later learned there are also like sects that are like, well, first of all, there are sects that are actually pro emotions.
Yes.
And there are also like Puritan Vulcan sects that are against mixing with alien species.
Yes.
So even among Vulcans, there are the claim that they're 100% logical is a bit of a reach.
Yeah. And in fact, we come to learn Spock has a brother that's part of one of these sects. He
Yeah,
actually leads one of them.
exactly.
I mean, it's interesting talking about the philosophy that comes along with that they abide by that gives them this, let's say, logic in the way that they exert that mental control. But that's not to say that they aren't a spiritual people. I find it very interesting that when it comes to like spirituality, spiritual beliefs, there actually is, how do I put it? They're polytheistic, as in they believe in like multiple gods and they believe in a state of consciousness called the Katra. They use
Yeah,
meditation to help them not just with maintaining control, but with, it's part of their spiritual practice. It's so, this sort of like mysticism is also deeply embedded in their culture.
true. And that leads to them having many rituals. I think a lot of the practices that they couldn't, logic away were preserved in the form of very strict rituals.
Mm-hmm.
And those rituals kind of their outlet for things that cannot be logicked, shall we say, that they can't control or meditate away or, you know, suppress until they go away.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is most commonly people refer to the Ponfar, which is their biological imperative to mate.
Yeah, supposedly they have other rituals, but this
Yeah,
is probably the most well known one. Yeah.
yeah. However, one of the ways they get around that, them establishing like their romantic relationships, right, their partnerships, it knowing that the Ponfar is part of their biology and it's not something they can control, and so when the time comes, it's as if they want to be as prepared as they can, and this has led to the practice of them betrothing their children, usually around the age of 7, together, who are in a sense bonded such that when the time comes for them to perform the ritual, because of this biological imperative, that they are uh, already have a mate who may or
Yeah.
may not be willing to go through the Ponfar with them.
Yeah.
But just in general, I think it's a good point that the rituals of Vulcans, and tied to this mysticism, makes them more mysterious, and they don't share a lot of information with outsiders about the things that are part of their religion and their culture as it relates to their very private rituals.
Well, I think it really depends on the era. In
Mm-hmm.
the Enterprise era, humans barely knew anything about Vulcans, and Vulcans weren't very keen on sharing anything with humans. In the original series, there is more context, and humans know more about Vulcan philosophy, but Vulcans still kind of. So Vulcans kept their pride. They didn't like showing the parts of themselves that they felt were, less than perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time we roll around to like Voyager and the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, I think Vulcan culture is kind of like very well known among Federation species. Like people already know what Ponfar is,
Right.
at least in Voyager. Non Vulcans already know it, even if they haven't met a Vulcan before.
But it does take them a while to get there.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a testament to how humans influenced Vulcans. Vulcan culture kind of shifted along the way.
Mm-hmm. Going back to their pride, I think it's a point of pride that they say they do not lie.
Yeah.
And let's just be clear, it's not that they cannot lie and they don't lie. They prefer to just tell the truth in such a way that is not technically a lie.
It's a blatant lie. They lie.
But it's just their whole attitude, right? Their attitude to
Yeah.
deception is um, we do not deceive. You know, we're
Yeah.
very logical, and therefore everything that we tell you is based off of this logic and as truthful as we can make it, as
Yeah.
honest as we can make it. I just find that very entertaining because actually, when I started thinking about it, there's some other races that have a similar aversion to lying.
Mm.
But I find that very dichotomous about Vulcans. We don't lie, but yet they do.
Yeah.
We talked about the fact that they might have children bonded at a young age, but why is that necessary? Well, or how is it possible? It's because they are also a species that is telepathic.
True. But they're only their telepathic abilities are limited.
Yes.
They are only touch. They only practice touch telepathy. Most of them, at least.
Most of them.
Yeah, most of the time, in the original series, the writers kind of went back and forth on exactly how powerful their telepathic abilities are. But I think in later series, it was kind of cemented that they only practice touch telepathy, and even then, they have to like really focus on it to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, oh, I can touch someone and immediately know their thoughts. No, it's an involved process.
It's very interesting, right? Because they're most famous, of course, for the mind meld,
Yeah.
which is part of that touch telepathy where they can touch you in like specific places and use that to communicate with your mind. But while you say they're pretty much touch telepaths, it is true that that Spock at least does some things that are a little beyond like what you would think is the range of a touch telepath.
Yeah.
I agree with you that I think the writers were kind of playing around with it. Do you recall them doing anything beyond touch to telepathy with Vulcans in other shows outside of the original series that was kind of questionable?
Not really. Um, no, I don't think so.
Okay. Again, so touch telepathy is very important, and also one of the means by which they transfer their katra at the time of death, right?
Yeah.
So Vulcans, being very logical as they are, do not see death as something to be feared.
I mean, it's not something to be feared, but it's like they're not like a death cult. Like they don't like. Yeah. I mean, they
It,
still avoid it.
I mean, surely, yes, but knowing that eventually they at some point will die is they don't. All I'm trying to say is they have this last ritual when it comes to any Vulcan who is going to die and is
Yeah.
prepared for it and is in a position where he can transfer his katra to either another individual or into the archives. Is that what they call it?
Um.
it's
Yeah.
very it's very interesting.
Yeah. Interesting enough, in Enterprise, we kind of learned that Vulcans, the telepathy, kind of was kind of a taboo in Vulcan culture
Mm-hmm.
for many, many years, to the point where Vulcans who practiced it were shunned, um,
Mm-hmm.
at least in Enterprise time. So it is interesting to think about because it seems like those were the thing with the Katras and all that. It seems like those were very ancient rituals that kind of disappeared when the telepathy taboo was created
Yeah.
and maybe preserved by very few people who kept the old ways or something like that, and only like regained popularity in like original series time.
Mm-hmm. Would you say Vulcans are, on paper, the most robust species in Trek as far as their
No,
how they're
absolutely not.
developed?
Absolutely not.
Okay,
100% not. Um,
100% not.
yeah, Vulcans. The original series expanded upon them. Enterprise expanded on them a little, and that's about it, honestly. I guess in the new shows, Discovery kind of expands upon them, Discovery and Strange New Worlds. But apart from that, Vulcans don't get as much screen time as other species we can name.
Do you think that's deliberate?
I think it's just because every species in Trek represents something very specific, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's because the things that Vulcans are supposed to represent are not as interesting as maybe other species are to writers.
So Vulcans are what? Just the allies of the humans in the good fight?
They are the allies of the humans, but they kind of represent the opposing force of logic over feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and they do serve their purpose in stories. But I think as far as literary devices go, they're kind of limited in that regard.
I agree. I think it's just very, in a sense, strange because Vulcans are so well known.
They are, but as I
And
said, there are species that are better known than them.
I think even for Star Trek fans, they're a very beloved concept.
They are a beloved concept, but I think, when most people think about cool species, Vulcans are kind of at the bottom of the list. Because, they have their gimmick, and their visuals aren't that interesting. Like they're basically humans with pointy ears and bow cuts. So, you know, they are like this, they're this well-known species, but they're not the most well-known, the most well-developed. They're just there.
But they did give us Spock,
But they did give us
which
Spock,
is
yes.
probably the most beloved character in Star Trek.
Yes, yeah. Which Star Trek can seem to let go of. Sadly.
Correct. Well, who knows? Even with Strange New Worlds, right? There is an
Yeah,
opportunity to give us more that we didn't previously know about Vulcans to add to the canon.
true.
So we'll see what else they give us. But I'd say, in a nutshell, I think we covered it from the appearance to the abilities and the culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you think Vulcans are the most well-developed species, most robust species in the franchise?
No.
Yeah.
How do I put this? Um, if you only know, let's say, like the original series, then, well, one, you're limited on species, but
Yeah.
of the ones that came out of the original series and like the animated series, Vulcans have there's the most information about Vulcans, which admittedly is not a lot.
Yeah.
And also a lot of it gets retconned. Some of it gets retconned later on. Yeah.
That's true.
But again, the original series was just a 3-season low budget sci-fi, and you didn't have the time to. It just always made me curious if there had been an opportunity to do more with Vulcans, to have a longer running show. For instance, Voyager, where we have Tuvok.
Yeah,
How much more would they add to what we know about Vulcans? And so far, it had, like you said, it has not been a
a
lot.
lot. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think Enterprise added kind of a lot because of its, setting.
Yeah, it just
It had the
feels
opportunity.
it feels like a missed opportunity to me.
Yeah.
I always appreciated their mystery, and sort of the fact that they were so logical and yet such a culture steeped in mysticism seemed to me that it's more than meets the eye.
Yeah,
They obviously have a very interesting backstory, being being this one type of very like passionate, violent race of people who decided to completely change the way they think and operate and interact with each other. Like
yeah.
a complete turnaround.
They changed the entire society.
That to me, I would have always loved to know, like, to see more of that, I think.
That would have been interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of,
Yep.
as we said, Vulcan history is hinted to be that they used to be a very emotional, passionate people who then completely changed their philosophy. But it is also hinted that there was a group of Vulcans who retained their original mindset and broke off from the Vulcans we know and set out to the stars to become a new people. And we also see them in the original series. We are talking about the Romulans.
That is correct. Which, at that point in time that they are introduced in the original series, are completely like mysterious race. No one
Yeah,
has seen a Romulan,
exactly.
and lo and behold, here they are, and they look like Vulcans.
Yeah, the Romulans and the humans had a war about 100 years or so before the events of the original series. But the war was fought completely over subspace radio without images, so humans and Romulans both have no idea how the other looks like. In in the original series, uh, the humans and Romulans finally get to see what each other looks like. And of course, humans are completely shocked to find out Romulans look a lot like Vulcans.
Yeah. But like you said, what differentiates them is this lack of living by logic.
Yeah. We don't get a lot of Romulans in the original series. You get like 2 episodes with Romulans. Both of them are very good, but they don't expand a lot about Romulan culture.
Mm-hmm.
Of what we get to see, they are more passionate and they're not logical like Vulcans, and they're a lot more militaristic.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. Far more militaristic. In fact, I think their race is somewhat modeled after the Romans.
Yeah, I think that was the original concept. Yeah,
Yeah, in Earth history, such that they were looking for, I think, a worthy adversary of Kirk, and they came
yeah,
up with this concept of Romulans who are like Roman culture taken to space.
yeah.
Very hierarchical caste system, militaristic, arrogant, passionate.
Exactly. Duty bound, all of those
Hmm.
things.
And
La-
most notably, running an empire.
exactly. Um, Later series, Next Generation and um, Deep Space Nine also had Romulans. The thing is, Romulans were never expanded upon really in any series. I think they are kind of expanded upon a little bit in Picard, but even then, not really. In Picard, probably more than any other show, though.
Hmm.
Romulan culture, the original concept of it was to be very militaristic and Roman-like, but in later shows, it reincarnated to be more secretive. They are actually
Yeah.
very, very secretive as part of their culture. So much so that in Picard we are told that Romulans have a front door and a secret real front door. Like a fake front door and a secret front door to their houses.
Yeah, I always thought that was funny.
Yeah. But yeah, Romulans are well known for being secretive, two-faced, as part of their culture. they deal with secrets. They suspect, and because of that, they also suspect everyone of doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So they are very very distrustful of everybody else.
I was just thinking, physically, some Romulans, they have the pointed ears, right? They
Yeah.
have sort of the like upswept eyebrows, um, but some of them have the ridges of
I think in later series
yeah.
they added regions. Yeah.
And the other thing that I thought was interesting, given that they're both from Romulans and Vulcans are from the same ancestors, if you will, life signs appear to be different. So enough that you could distinguish a Vulcan from a Romulan, so that there's some that implies there's some like evolutionary change to their race once they leave Vulcan and settle on Romulus. They're at some point they have more physical differences than maybe they did when they originally settled
Yeah.
as an offshoot of the Vulcan species. But I completely agree with you. They're very like suspicious by nature, secretive. They can be really xenophobic.
Yeah.
And
I think most of them are very xenophobic.
yeah, and
It's kind of part of their culture because they're so distrustful of everybody else.
mhm. I always thought there were some similarities between them and the next race we're going to talk about.
Could be. Other things I want to mention are, well, we learn in the next generation about their secret police of sorts
Mhm.
called the Tal, and they are basically, they do what the secret police do. They infiltrate every aspect of Romulan life, and they have eyes everywhere. So, Romulans are distrustful of each other too. It's not just they're distrustful of strangers, they're distrustful of each other. There is literally no one you can trust in Romulan society. Um, the sole exception, as we learn in Picard, are the Coat Milat, which are a group of warrior nuns who
Oh
train in
yeah.
who train in absolute honesty, which is very rare in Romulan culture.
Yes.
They believe in absolute candor, absolute honesty. They always speak the truth. It's part of their values and philosophies, and they dedicate themselves
Mhm.
to hopeless causes, which is very funny. I think
Mhm.
they are very interesting. I would love to know where they came from. I wish we knew more about their history. Um,
I mean, yeah. Oh, warrior race of nuns, of course.
yeah,
Probably the other thing I would mention to Romulans, before we moved away from the topic, you mentioned like there's more about them in Picard, and that's because they're
yeah,
at a point in their history where they have lost their home planet to a
yeah.
supernova. Initial, let's say, like isolationism of their society, their empire separated by like the neutral zone from everybody else. At some point that they become more, I'd say, interactive with the Federation. Even
They
with
have no choice.
they
Yeah,
they really have no choice though. At a certain point,
yeah,
like I think there's like a faction of them that want to learn more about Vulcans, and then of course this supernova event happens and then forces them to be
yeah.
essentially at the mercy of other races.
Yeah, I think in the next generation, there is a storyline of Spock trying to bridge the gap between
Yes.
Vulcans and Romulans. And there are Romulans who are open to the idea. Um, and yeah, after the events of the alternate after alternate timeline movies, the Romulan the Romulan home planet is destroyed,
Mm-hmm.
and all surviving Romulans are basically refugees. They have no homes. Um, and we see how in the first season of Picard we see how the Federation tries to help them and the varying degrees of trust Romulans put in the Federation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's also the fact that the Federation didn't make it out there in time to help them.
Exactly.
Just adds to that suspicious nature, that lack of trust.
Yeah. But in Discovery, in season 3 of Discovery, we travel to the year 3000.
Mm-hmm.
And we find out that Romulans and Vulcans basically reunited, and they're both living now on what used to be Vulcan. They
Mm-hmm.
changed their name. I forgot the name of the new planet. But yeah,
Yeah. If you get that far, if you get that far
Fox,
out,
Nivar.
yeah.
They changed the name of the planet to Nivar, and now they're all Nivarians. And they found a way to synthesize both of their cultures into a cohesive culture, and they are very peaceful, actually. They are no longer part of the Federation, though. During the third season, later they rejoin. But it's very interesting to see that Spock's efforts bore fruit. So good for him.
So, is there anything else to mention here about Romulans?
Not that I know of.
I'd say only that they're another example of a race, I think, that was well received with this introduction, at least in the Balance of Terror, a worthy adversary of Kirk. I think the writers, I remember reading something like from DC Fontana, who said that next to Vulcans, she thought Romulans were the most interesting species introduced
Hmm,
in the
I
original
see.
series. At least they had the opportunity to do more with them.
Yeah.
I think we should move on, though, to
Yeah, probably the most well-known species to come out of the original series, and probably the most well-known species in all of Star Trek canon.
yes.
Yeah, we are talking, of course, about Klingons.
Who have, in a sense, undergone some very phenomenal transformations throughout Star Trek.
True, true. The Klingons started out as kind of stand-ins for the Soviets in the Cold War. The Federation, of course, being a stand-in for the West, or America more specifically.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so the Klingons were the Soviets. The Federation and the Klingons during the original series time were in a sort of a Cold War, where they both try to expand their reach and gain more friends, let's say, across the galaxy. The Klingons were, it's kind of ironic. We talked about how the Romulans were very militaristic. The Klingons weren't that militaristic when they were first introduced.
No, they're basically like a warrior race flying around fighting people.
Yeah, but they're not that hierarchical. They're not that violent, which is which is kind of funny when you consider the later incarnation.
Yeah.
They were very underhanded. They did tend toward fascism and lack of democracy. They ruled over other people, as opposed to the federations, who are the good guys who wanted people to join them.
I mean, that's true. I always thought of their society as pretty complex. Because, I mean, and we can talk about this a little more in detail, but their society or their cultures had decline, right? From the
Yeah.
way they were in the past, I'd say before TOS, for a period afterwards, actually. But again, I mean, I think they are considered like a militaristic type civilization. It's driven by, let's say, philosophy of a warrior and the need to conquer.
Yeah, I think.
That is what I think sets them apart from others. Okay, given their politics, given their military, they're most concerned with going out and conquering in the name of like honor and reputation.
Yeah, I think again, I'm trying to kind of separate later incarnation of the Klingons as we
Mm-hmm.
know them today from how they were presented in the original series. In the original series, they did have a thing about being conquerors, but there wasn't really a warrior culture. Like
No,
you
not an
didn't
obvious
see.
warrior culture.
Yeah, you
Correct.
didn't see you didn't really see Klingons referring to themselves as warriors or talking about being great warriors. They did have a conquering culture, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, then we hit uh, Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, both shows that had a Klingon main character and a very heavy emphasis on developing the Klingons as a culture.
Mm-hmm.
They also got, a reboot of appearance. Suddenly there were a lot more. They had a lot more forehead ridges and a lot more hair.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, we obviously don't know this in the original series. This is part of the overall history of the civilization. They were a warlike people, but they were separated into houses, and they were fighting
Yeah,
among each other, right?
yeah,
They were always like their clans, like clan like civilization. They were always having a lot of inner fighting, and at some point that deteriorated to where they had to institute a militaristic type structure to almost like to keep their civilization together. And that's the point at which I think they're supposedly introduced in the original series, right?
yeah.
They're not so much individualism as they are being managed by by that military structure in order to keep them from like imploding as a race.
Yeah, but again, this is kind of a retcon from later series. We
Yeah,
don't really know that based on the original
right.
series. Yeah,
But I always thought that was supposed to explain why we saw them as
yeah,
we did,
yeah,
um, when they were just essentially just presented as like a Cold War antagonist.
exactly. But then Next Generation came, and on top of rebooting their appearances, we also got a whole new language in the 80s.
Yeah.
Someone actually created the Klingon language, and suddenly we had a language for a species. There were attempts to do this with Vulcans, but I don't think they ever got as robust as they did with Klingons.
Mm-hmm.
Klingons have an actual artificial language that someone invented for them. It has rules, it has grammar, it has everything.
And it sounds very awesome when you speak it. It's very
Yeah,
gravelly and
yeah,
befitting
it
of a
was
warrior race, right?
fitting over very much, yeah. Um, and yeah, this or the Next Generation did a lot to develop Klingon culture, like a lot, a lot, a lot. We had entire storylines of Klingon politics on the Klingon homeworld of Kronos. Um, we had, you know, we had Klingons drama, Klingon opera. They have
Mm-hmm.
operas. Klingon legends,
Poetry.
Klingon religion, Klingon poetry, of course. We have Klingon mating rituals. We have everything Klingon. Klingon fashion. We even have a lot of information about Klingon biology, probably more than people wanted to know.
So true.
Yeah. So
With their multiple organs.
yeah,
Multiple
yeah,
in case they get stabbed in one, they have another copy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Klingon pets, we know about Targs, but yeah, Klingons are got a lot of development, and of course they got a lot of development about their um, culture and philosophy. Klingons are very much a warrior culture, and the thing that they hold most dearly is honor.
Yeah.
If the Vulcans have logic, Klingons have honor. Everything has to be honorable,
Mm-hmm.
or so we think. The main representative of the Klingons in the franchise is Worf, who's the main character on both the Next Generation and later Deep Space Nine. But in the tradition of Spock, while we kind of get to know Worf as like the representative of Klingons, we later learn that he doesn't really represent them. Worf is very preoccupied with honor, which is nominally Klingon tradition, but in reality, Klingons don't actually care that much about honor.
It is quite the weapon that they use
Yeah,
against their own people. I mean, for example, if you do something dishonorable, you could essentially ruin your entire house, or
yeah,
basically your family lineage is thrown out.
yeah.
It's taboo, from banned from that point on. So they make a lot of, how do I put it? They're very strict about honor, given that many of them are shady.
Yeah, I think they care more about the appearance of being honorable than
Yes.
actually being honorable.
Yes. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So, for example, we see that if you are exposed in Klingon society for something dishonorable, you will be shunned. But behind the scenes, they do dishonorable things all the time. Granted that no one finds out. So yeah, do you think there is a species that is more developed than the Klingons?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so either.
No, I mean, there's even Klingon music.
Yeah,
I mean, that's why I was trying to make a distinction. It seems to me that like Vulcans are well known, but Klingons are the most infamous,
yeah,
but also probably the most entertaining, because they go to such lengths to solidify their culture, their habits, their own language. They put so much effort into developing that species. You just can't help but appreciate that, I think. Even if they were originally created to be essentially just the antagonists of the Federation.
yeah. They were originally created like that, and interesting enough, I think it's interesting that even during the original series, there was like the hint that this will not last. This
Yeah.
rivalry, they will become allies sooner or later.
Well, they literally had an alien race called the Organians try to get them to stop fighting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and and literally the next franchise, they're like, yeah, we're no longer enemies.
Can we just talk for a second about the Klingon Romulan relationship?
Okay,
If you have two separate empires, Klingon Empire, the Romulan Empire, naturally they would want to squabble over territory, or they would both be too arrogant to want to be allies. But we do find at some point in that they are in fact they are in fact allies against a greater enemy, right?
yeah, but it's not like a great friendship, right?
It's not, because it doesn't last.
Yeah,
I always thought that was interesting, because from the point of view of Star Trek, right, we're mostly seeing humans interacting with all the other species of the Federation, and then you have just the antagonists who show up.
yeah,
When you want to insert them, unless, of course, you put one of them, onto the crew of the Enterprise, like Worf,
yeah,
which then forces more the antagonists to show up more often. You learn more about them that way, but you never really think about what's the relationship like between the antagonists themselves.
yeah.
And that's where I always found the relationship between Klingon, Romulan, what we learned of it is, as interesting.
Yeah, they're not great friends, but they're not as bitter enemies as the Federation and the Romulans.
Right.
Let's say. They collaborate sometimes, but you can see that the Klingons don't really appreciate the dishonorable way Romulans conduct their business.
Yep.
Because Romulans are so secretive and they like using spies, and Klingons like to use brute force and face their enemies head on.
Yeah. That's very true. That's probably one of their most telling differences in just the way they operate. Klingons are very much in your face,
Yeah,
and Romulans lean more into secrecy and potential deception.
Yeah, Klingons are really the main species they can think of that we find out they don't really have a version of a secret police or a internal intelligence
Mm-hmm.
agency. Even the humans have something like that, but not Klingons.
I always thought that there was like an implied Big Brother situation in the Klingon hierarchy, just because they are so militaristic in that they have ranks, and everybody's vying to get everybody else's position.
Yeah, but it's not secretive. Like you're not
No,
you don't suspect someone of doing it. Like someone wants to take your position.
that's
You
true.
don't suspect it.
But you're always being held to a standard because someone will very quickly take the opportunity to step into your position by
Yeah,
eliminating you.
yeah.
Yes. What did you think of what was his name? Gorkin, the chancellor? He was like the ambassador.
Which one?
Gorkon in the
Who
movie.
was he? Oh, in the movie. Which movie?
The one that McCoy had to operate on.
I
Basic.
don't remember him.
Okay, so wasn't he in the undiscovered country?
Oh, that one, the one
Yeah,
that died.
yeah, the one. That's what I said. The one who McCoy had to operate on but died.
Yeah.
Basically, like the ambassador. Anyway, where I was going with that was it. So we talked about how there came a point where they're trying to smooth relations with the Klingon Empire.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, it was at a point in time where the Klingon homeworld needed some help, and it wasn't just because they decided they wanted to do a peace treaty.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, the moon where they mined a very
Yeah.
important resource blew up, and they were kind of stranded without this very important resource. So they had no choice but to ask for help.
Yes. But that in no way, shape, or form implies that there was the fall of the Klingon Empire.
Yeah.
And that it's just that the relationship between the Federation and the Klingon Empire wasn't as fraught as it was during essentially their Cold War.
That's true, but a century later in Deep Space Nine, we kind of learned that the Klingon Empire is kind of done, and
Yeah.
that's mostly because they don't stick to their values,
Mm-hmm.
basically. It's too corrupt. It's too bloated, and yeah, it keeps falling apart. It keeps being pulled into different directions. The drama around who will rule it gets very, very intense and way too frequent. It becomes unstable. We don't really see what happens to it, though. Like, I don't remember it being mentioned in the future we see in Discovery.
Mm-hmm. Just how they tried to explain the physical appearance change.
I well, there was a plot line in Enterprise about like a virus or some shit. I don't I don't care. Honestly, the best explanation is the original series was set in the original series was filmed in the 1960s on a shoestring budget. And the Next Generation and the original series movies were not. They actually had a budget for costumes. This is the explanation.
But what you referenced there was like the augmentation virus or something of that nature.
Yeah,
They were trying to
I
make
think
super warriors and it backfired and
yeah,
caused them to look more
human.
human.
Yeah. And then Discovery came, and for the first two seasons, they had like really weird looking Klingons, and like we're supposed to believe they actually looked like that first, and then like humans, and then kind of like something in the middle.
Oh, are you referring to when they were this almost like bug-like looking species with the big
Yeah,
exoskeleton?
yeah,
And then somehow the primordial ooze like helped them evolve
yeah,
into humanoids.
yeah. It was very weird.
Yeah.
I think most people can agree that the Next Generation era look is the definitive Klingon look.
Although I have to say, if you were to watch the Abrams verse movies, the Klingons look pretty awesome in those movies.
I don't even remember how they looked in those movies. They were on screen for like, what, 2 seconds?
They were when Uhura was speaking Klingon.
Yeah, for
But
two
you know,
seconds.
the one Klingon they had with the bald head, he had the big flat nose and the ridges, but he also had a lot of facial jewelry, like rings and
I vaguely remember. I
yeah.
think at the time, I think I thought like they look way too much like Tellarites. That's very confusing.
To me, that is one of the that is the only time I've seen a Klingon with uh like nose rings and earrings and basically some type of ornamentation to the face.
No, I think in the original series there were a few Klingons with earrings. I remember some of them. I think,
Okay.
but yeah, but I think the of what I remember of the new movies, the Klingons there, for their very very brief appearance, looked way too much like Tellarites. And speaking of, the Romulans, Vulcans, and Klingons are the three biggest species of the original series. But it introduces to two more species that, while not as expanded upon, are kind of important to the lore of Star Trek, which are the two other species besides Vulcans and humans who are the founders of the Federation,
Yes.
which are the Andorians, who thankfully later got some development in Enterprise. Not a lot because Enterprise was cancelled in its youth, but um, but yeah, Andorians and Tellarites. The Andorians are blue aliens with antennas, and the Tellarites kind of look like humanoid pigs with a lot of hair.
Oh goodness.
Yeah.
So I read the development of the Andorians was a literal last minute call.
Okay.
They were getting ready to shoot an episode and they decided they needed to put in a new like race. I think it's the person who's sort of like who was helping design some of the species just decided to stick antennas on, on like white on the white wigs that they had put on them.
Nice.
Yeah, because it was also the least time consuming to put them in that makeup. Some like it didn't take nearly as long as putting Spock's ears on. But they were like intentionally kept very vague as a
Yeah.
species because they had
Yeah.
not prepared them in advance. Do you know what I'm saying? They'd not like written a concept for Andorians before the episode aired.
Yeah, I can't believe that. I mean, in this episode, we saw a lot of like species of
Mm-hmm.
aliens in the background. Like, not even all of them got names, I think. But yeah, I'm wondering if the Tellarites did have a concept because they looked really like someone just found this weird costume
Uh
in the
huh.
back of the closet and just put them on. Um, so, like I said, the Andorian culture was developed a little bit later in
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek Enterprise. We learned that Andoria is a very, very cold place. Um, and Andorians actually come in two subspecies. There are the regular Andorians who are blue,
Yes.
and there are the Anar who are white and are blind, but they have telepathic powers. They have like
Yes.
actual telepathy, not like the weird touch telepathy Vulcans have. The Anar,
I always wondered why did they decide to do that? Why make a like subspecies that is has more abilities than that your the regular species doesn't have?
I don't know honestly. Um, I really don't understand the concept of the Anar and introducing them because we already know so little about Andorians themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need a subspecies
Exactly. That's my point. Why
of
did
them?
we need this blind but telepathic subspecies of Andorians? For a plot point?
I guess so. I really couldn't tell you more than that. We learned that Andorians are used to very cold temperatures, and they are very they had a very apparently a very proud tradition of mining ice. Like of what we see in Enterprise, we meet some ice miner and Andorians who are very proud of it, and they have this ritualistic battle using mining tools, which is very interesting. The antennas are kind of uh, they are sensory like aids. They
Yeah.
give them input on their environments, and without one, like they have some difficulties navigating their surroundings.
Yeah. I mean, I always thought that they added in the lore that they're very good, like, physical combatants.
Hmm.
They can take you in a fight, but that half of that is due to their perception with their antenna, because physically they don't look like warriors, right? They're supposed to be sort
Yeah,
of like a tall, slender race.
yeah,
Um, but that's supposed to be deceptive in that they are actually almost like a warrior race, and that they have physical combatants is what I'm trying to say.
yeah. That's very possible. Yeah, that's basically all we learn of Andorians. The development of Andorians is one of those things where I kind of do wish Enterprise got 3 more seasons to expand on
Yeah.
them because they were going somewhere interesting with them. Enterprise also expanded a little bit about Tellarites. We learned that Tellarites really like to argue,
Yes.
basically. They like to argue, that's their trait.
They like to argue with Andorians.
And Andorians, but really in general.
Yeah.
That's their thing.
Okay, so Tellarites physically look like these kind of stout little race of people. The way they in the original series, the way they made their face almost look like they had a snout, kind of like a
Yeah,
pig. So
yeah.
some people tend to call them like the pig race in Star Trek, but that's not really what they are. Although I think later on some of them were given like tusk.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
they sort of did continue that concept. But like you said, I think they're most known for being argumentative, and that they're really kind of like the Ferengi. They're involved in some shady business.
Sometimes, but I mean, I don't think we established them enough. Yet, they don't really establish them enough that we can get like a proper sense of what they're about.
Hmm. What I understood was that the Tellarites and the Andorians had some kind of fight over the Tellarites being involved with the Orions at one point, the pirating
Yes.
business.
So, I was going to mention
Hmm.
the Orions is the last species that was
Yeah.
introduced.
So we can
Um,
talk about them for sure.
yeah. But yeah, Tellarites had some, they were merchants mostly, and they
Hmm.
had some territorial beef with the Andorians in the Enterprise,
Yeah.
um, which the Federation helped solve, presumably.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but yeah, we don't really know that much about both Andorians and especially Tellarites. Like, Tellarites are really a mystery.
Hmm. What's interesting, Soda, is there's a Tellarite in Prodigy.
Hmm.
Star Trek Prodigy, one of the characters is a Tellarite who is actually an engineer,
Mm-hmm.
who got stuck on that world with all the other captured people, and when he escapes with this crew of basically children.
Yeah.
He doesn't quite seem like a child himself, but it's interesting because I think it's from the perspective of he doesn't know of the Federation, and I thought that would be an opportunity for them to introduce more information about Tellarites, but so far he's just been very He does like to argue. He's very stubborn. He's impatient. He loves to eat,
Okay.
and he's very good with machines. That's
Yeah,
it.
I mean, well,
I keep waiting for some backstory on Tellarites.
yeah, I don't know if a kids show will be the place where they do it. It would be very surprising to me if they do
Yeah.
that. But could be, maybe. I mean, it's about time, 60 years later, that we learn something about Tellarites,
Yeah.
besides the fact that they argue.
So should we move on to Orions?
Yeah, those are, I think, the last prominent species we learn. And I think that, they are basically the second species introduced are the Vulcans, right? Because
Yeah.
the Orion slave girl the Orion slave girl was in the pilot, in the original pilot, before Kirk was even there. So yeah, the first Orion we see is an Orion slave girl. So Orions are the green people. They are the quintessential aliens. They are green. um, we learned that they have slaves. Well, presumably we learned that they have slaves. Later series show us Orions as pirates. Um, as early as the original series animated series, right?
Yeah.
We meet Orion pirates.
And I think even technically that time they're in the slave trade.
Yeah,
And it's sort of ironic because in the original series you actually see the Orion as a slave, a female
yeah,
slave, and then later you learn that the Orions themselves are slave traders, and it's very possible that the females who, because they're a matriarchal society and females are in authority.
yeah. But like, we don't really learn that they are a matriarchal society until much, much
Right,
later.
until much, much later. But I'm just saying, if you go back and knowing that information and looking at what you saw in the original series, you could take it from a different perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah, just in that the Orion slave girl who is present in that episode is there because she's undercover.
yeah. But like, I think that's kind of okay. So what I was going with is this: we see the Orions, being pirates, being in all of the shadiest business around
Yeah.
the universe. They are the bad guys. They're like the go-to bad guys for a one-off episode. Like, if you need some generic villains, we have Orion Pirates here for you to mess shit up.
The funny thing is, they're even the bad guys to the bad guys.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of free agents
Yeah.
because they're pirates. Um, but then I think because of, well, the very sexist nature of slave girls, in the Enterprise, they kind of try to put this weird twist where they're actually matriarchal,
Mm-hmm.
and Orion females have these very special pheromones that hypnotize men. And so when they actually saw the slave girls, they're actually trying to seduce men to become slaves themselves.
Right.
Um, it's it's kind of a cheap retcon. I think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I think they are kind of trying to fix it in Lower Decks. In
Yeah.
Lower Decks, one of the main characters is an Orion, who is in Starfleet actually, and she is kind of trying to break stereotypes about Orions. And we see that they are actually kind of matriarchal, but not all women are just spreading around pheromones and dancing half naked all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of a cheap retcon, because it's like, yeah, they are being sexualized, but there is a reason they're actually very empowered while doing it. Like, no, it's just you're just trying to excuse it.
So to my mind, Orion's, as you said, have always been the generic bad guy. If you want to talk about a dangerous encounter in the middle of nowhere, Orion pirates just run into them.
Yeah,
Right? It's
exactly.
like the people you have to avoid no matter where you are or who you are.
They're kind of low stakes villains,
Yeah.
right? Because they're not very strong, and they don't have like the backing of an empire, so it's not like a war like you have with Romulans
Mm-hmm.
or Klingons. You don't have to address the politics of it because they're just pirates. They
Right.
are
You don't
free
have to deal with
agents.
a race who has a militia.
Yeah. So if it's, for example, a story of like one ship versus one ship, without if you don't want to get into all the politics of it all, Orions are like the perfect go-to villain.
Yep. And sadly, that's all we can say about them.
Yep. And I really hope that Lower Decks continues developing them
Mm-hmm.
because what we saw so far is very interesting.
It also implies that they're trying to make a cultural shift.
Yeah, that too, but also that like it's not a monolithic culture.
Mm-hmm. And not everybody wants to be stereotyped as a pirate or a slave trader.
Yeah.
Right.
So those are really the main important species that were introduced in the original series, I think.
Mm-hmm. So since we've covered the original series and we did have a number of species to talk about, obviously we have a full list with more on there. We're going to get to the other shows in a part 2 of this podcast, so stay tuned.
Yes, we have a lot to cover. Star Trek loves introducing new species, and we love talking about them.
Exactly. Until next time.
Bye, everybody.